podcast, Alan Colquitt talks about future of performance management in the future of work. So stay tuned. So welcome everyone to Jobs of Future podcast. Today we have with us Alan Colquitt. Alan is a talent management, organizational change and human capital analytics expert. He has worked as an internal consultant in the pharmaceutical and consumer product industries, building organizational capabilities, advising executives, business leaders and HR professionals. He is frequently sought out by private and public companies, consulting organizations, professional organizations and academic institutions as an expert advisor. He is a frequent speaker, presenter at professional meetings and conferences on a wide variety of talent management and human capital analytics topics. His thinking and research appeared in many books, chapters, articles, blog posts, magazines, and white papers. Alan is a licensed psychologist in the state of Indiana. With that, Alan, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, great. Great to be here.
Interesting. I think one of the very fascinating thing that I found about your profile is obviously you have a background in performance management and you have a psychologist degree. So why don't you walk us through your journey? Like what brought you to this area of motivational control management and what's your background?
Yeah, to me it's unexpected. If you asked me 30 years ago, where do you think you'll be spending your time? When you're later in your career, it probably would not have been where I'm at. So to me it's kind of fascinating. So again, as you said, trained as a psychologist, individual differences. I was trained in a psychology department, not in a business school. So my focus, truly is in individual differences, psychology, psychological thinking applied to the organization and the workplace. So I spent 5 years at P&G early on in my career, mostly focused on designing employee, hiring and selection systems, development systems. Some work on organizational design and consulting toward the end of that time period. And then 27 years at Eli Lilly and Company, a pharmaceutical company located in the Midwest. Eli Lilly is mostly an ethical pharmaceutical company, purely prescription-based medicines, very integrated, single kind of company, not diversified like most pharma companies are today. Pure ethical prescription-based pharmaceutical play for the most part. Also animal health. There, I've done the gamut. I've run the gamut of kind of focusing on very individual system design, like hiring systems and leadership identification systems, assessment systems for administrative decisions, and also for things like development. Also more team design work, team development work, leadership teams, work teams, self-managed teams, assessing them, diagnosing them, design them. And then also alliances and partnerships, which are critical in the pharmaceutical business. A lot of work designing, systems for assessing them, partnering with them, diagnosing them, and intervening to make those partnerships more effective. And then finally, a fair amount of work at the organizational level as well, doing what I would call strategy implementation work, not necessarily formulation work, but strategy implementation, organization design, organization capability assessment, diagnosis. And then, about 7 or 8 years ago, through some HR reorganization, I took responsibility for performance management, which turned out to be, an interesting choice because I've gotten very, very deep into it. So I took ownership of it. I inherited a head count with it. And so I had studied performance management my entire career, studied it, maintained these systems, fixed these systems, worked on it, but I've never owned them. When I took ownership for it about 7 years ago, I immediately started getting all the hate mail and all the phone calls. And so that led me down this kind of journey to deep study and deep understanding of the science behind performance management, and understanding all the forces that are driving it, and the practices and the effectiveness of them, and so on. So this is what kind of propelled me down the path of working to redesign performance management at the company I worked in, as also to kind of write about it, write about what I've learned in the book I published last year, and then to now be more since I retired from Lilly at the end of last year, now I'm much more kind of an evangelist, kind of trying to spread the word in this area, and doing some consulting and advising as well, but also writing and things to kind of promote the ideas that I've got. So since I retired, I'm a little consultant my current role is really part-time consultant, part-time teacher, faculty, professor. I signed on with an HR think tank. Some of your listeners, and you may be familiar with Ed Lawler and John Boudreau, the members of the Center for Effective Organizations at USC, University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Signed on as an affiliate research scientist with them. So I'm kind of playing in a number of different sandboxes over the past 6 to 8 months, but performance management kind of evangelist is a primary one.
Interesting. Thank you for walking us through your background. So tell us more about your academic side. Like, what do you do on the academic front nowadays?
Yeah. Well, mostly on the academic side, it's purely teaching. I've taught MBA in the MBA program at the Kelley School of Business at IUPUI, which is an Indiana University, Purdue University satellite Indian campus in Indianapolis. So traditional org behavior for MBA students, and then also at Butler University, another smaller local private university here in town. Taught organization behavior there. But I have always been kind of an academic thinker, always been very theoretically oriented, interested in theory, interested in theories and frameworks as a way of explaining and understanding practices and which practices are optimal, whether it's for onboarding or for hiring or for development and training or for leadership. So I've always had one eye on the outside looking at science and what's happening in science, whether it's in leadership or performance management or rewards, and one eye also on the practice, what's happening in practice in organizations. So I've always been fairly externally focused, whether it's more academic and what's happening at universities or in practice and understanding what's happening in organizations.
Interesting. We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Interesting. Again, thank you so much for walking us through that. So whenever I hear about performance management, I think one of the interesting story that comes to my mind is, so I was talking to this assistant coach of one of the local team in Boston, football team, and he was talking about, hey, do you know, Vishal, why we are what we are? I said, why? He said that our job is to work with each of these individual players, understand their background, understand their upbringing, understand sort of the relationships, everything that we can find information on, and we give them access to the data today. We give them access to what kind of plays are famous, what kind of trends are happening nowadays, what's going on with every other team. But we use their sort of personal information to use them and make them one of the most powerful weapon that works together with collectively other players to create this amazing experience to win this enormous sort of competitive matches. And his worry was that in your case, in your typical enterprise world, you guys don't even have access to this mere data that gets you to perform the way you perform. Like, you are very obsolete. You still sort of work on tertiary motives to get compensation and all that to motivate you. What's your thinking? What's your thinking on some of the challenges and some of the sort of problem areas when it comes to performance management and how businesses perceive performance areas to be?
Well, I think, I would say, I think to me, one of the well, first of all, I think the problem is it's not working. So part of the question
Mm,
is, all right, it's not working. What are the root causes of this? So, I think part of uh, the most significant challenges, I think, well, they're really four, failure modes, if you want to call it that, for performance management. One, and they all, this is the marketing guy in me, which is not very good, obviously. They all start with P. So there's like,
mm,
practices is the first one. So the practices we are implementing, which is traditional performance management, everyone does the same. They set objectives at the beginning of the year. They have a review, usually mid-year, and then have a final review, and then we evaluate their performance and assign a rating to them. And that rating drives their rewards. Everyone does it the same way.
mm,
There's some marginal differences between companies, but by and large, everyone does it the same way. And that's generally not working. Those practices are not very effective. And if you doubt that, then you've not been reading any of the press. Um, and at the same time, the rewards practices are not working either. So when you read any benchmarking reports about and rewards practices, again, are fairly traditional. You have merit pay at the end of the year. This is an annual cycle. There's a big budget, and our job is to figure out how to divide that budget up, usually efficiently. Um, and we can go a lot deeper into the thinking behind that. And
mm,
because remember, this is our chief strategy for motivation. Okay, and there's a big pot of money, and our job is to figure out how to efficiently distribute it. Efficiency is probably not the lens that you want to
mm,
use when you think about motivating your best people. When you talk to the football coach, efficiency isn't in their mind when
mm,
you talk about how to make the best football team possible. Efficiency isn't one of the key criteria, but it is one of the key criteria in the
mm,
way we think about motivating motivational systems and organizations, because it's mostly money. It's a big pot of it.
mm,
We distribute it with merit increases, base pay increases, and we distribute it with bonus, with variable pay programs. And those aren't working either. We spend in the U.S. alone, estimated $345 billion a year in base pay increases and bonuses every year. And despite that massive sum of money, when you ask people, are we paying for performance? Are we differentiating performance? The answer is no. People are unhappy with what they get. They're unhappy with most of it. So the practices are not working at all. And part of the reason the practices aren't working is because the thinking, the upstream assumptions and beliefs on which those practices are based are problematic. Money motivates. These are all classic kind of psychological. You learn these in Psych 101, and you learn these in Econ 101. Financial rewards motivate. People are self-maximizing. Um, the law of effect. If you want to control people's behavior, control their consequences. The thinking, behind these theories, is vintage 1920 in some cases, and vintage 1950s. It certainly is. The thinking and the theories behind these practices are vastly outdated, and it's not surprising the practices are not effective. So the paradigms behind these practices are not effective either. And in the case of performance management, the purpose is a problem as well. Performance management does everything for everyone. If you look at any performance management book, there'll be 22 to 25 different purposes. And if one process cannot effectively serve that many masters,
mm,
way too many masters, conflicting expectations, there's no way this process will be effective. And then finally, there's a whole propaganda problem that with lots of focus on benchmarking, lots of focus on relying heavily on HR think tanks and big external consulting firms to guide us here. And so what happens is everyone is is shifted to the mode. Everyone is focused on modal common practices, which are not necessarily effective practices. So I think that the problems with this process are very broad, lots of problems, and they're very deep, which is why they're so resistant to change. Lots of tinkering. Companies continue to change this process every year or every 2 or 3 years. And they're always tinkering at the margins, and they're always tinkering in the orbit of the current traditional paradigms. Money motivates, pay for performance and contingent rewards motivate, and that kind of thinking. Classic kind of agency theory, tournament theory. If you want people to, you need carrots and sticks. That's what it's really primarily all about. So the problems are very broad, very deep, which is why you haven't seen much change.
Interesting. And if you look at the current authors, so when or current sort of researchers, when it comes to either Daniel Pink or like all of these guys are writing a lot about, hey, motivation is critical, like to understand what motivates people, and it's important. And right now it's not necessarily money, like it works, but then you see a sort of a decline in the performance. It just does some limited sort of things to help. So what is the resolve? Like what's your take that how is that landscape of performance changing when it comes to sort of how businesses could motivate their people and sort of have them as a high performance individual? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think the and Pink, I think Pink did a good job of laying out the problem statement. I think there were some things that Pink left out of the book. We're talking about the book Drive, published 7 or 8 years ago now. But the idea, I think the basic idea and the research foundation, that the great thing about Pink is the research foundation for Drive was pretty strong. Some people will quibble with it, like many people will quibble with whether money motivates and performance-based pay motivates. But I think the fundamental idea is that the kind of the center for motivation for people in traditional thinking is that motivation is external to somebody, extrinsic motivation, money, threats. This is classic agency theory, and for those of you interested in labor economics, and this is really a problem theory, because a lot of what we do is based on agency theory, which says you have a principal, which is a company, and an agent, which is an employee, and this is classic in economics, is that both are self-maximizing, both are self-interested. The employee is not going to align with the goals of the company; they have their own goals, and the company is not going to align with the goals of the employee. The assumption is the employee wants to goof off, and that in order to get the employee to align their goals with the company goals, we have to threaten them or incent them or put teeth into them and monitor and surveillance. That's the idea. And that it's external pressure motivates people. And I think the fundamental change in the future is that that's not the source of motivational energy for employees. The future is more around, people are looking for, is more around purpose, and Pink called, purpose, mastery, and autonomy. And the thing Pink left out that is critically important, this is from Edward Desi's research, is belonging. So I think that the big ideas for motivation and control, and I use control in a good way. Organizations need predictability, and so there have to be control systems set up for what do we work on and what don't we work on. So I think PM is a control system, but in a good way. So I think the center of the universe shifts from motivation is outside to motivation is inside. What we need, we need to, one of the big ideas is PM needs to focus more on goals and direction and purpose and meaning than it does evaluation and differentiation and rewards. So a sense of purpose and meaning are critically important to motivate people, which is why you find people doing things and doing volunteer work, 40, 50 hours a week, whether it's Wikipedia or when the Malaysia Air disaster happened, there were thousands, tens and hundreds of thousands of people sitting at the computer looking at video feeds for debris. And no one was paying them to do any of that. These are people that are just committed to serving a larger purpose and will do this without extrinsic rewards. So real purpose and meaning and goals and direction in performance management are the optimal way to create that. So performance management becomes a purpose and meaning machine rather than an evaluation and differentiation machine. Number one. And at the same time, talking about the future, the future of the worker is much more, people are much more interested in purpose and meaning in organizations now. And I think more progressive organizations and more progressive kind of organizational thinking is more purpose oriented as well. Whether you look at University of Michigan, the positive organizational scholarship ideas, other notions, the work that Aaron Hurst and Arthur Woods are doing with the purpose economy. If you look to the future, I think organizations are going that way and employees and people want to see that. They want meaning in their work. And performance management is the vehicle to give them meaning. So I think that's a key part. Belonging is another key part. And that's the piece that Pink really missed out on, I think. Organization, again, the future of organizations is not individuals. It's not individualistic systems, it's teams. Okay, so I think progressive organizations are going to be doing this process, performance management, not at the individual level. This is going to become a team sport. PM is going to be, the unit of analysis for PM in the future will be the team, because the team is the way work gets done. Teams, the work organizations need to do today is better done by teams, not by individuals. Difficult work, innovation work, where quality matters, and there's no right answer. When you look at those kind of filters, teams are the way you do the work. Teams are smarter than individuals at the kind of work that individuals have to do today. So the center for motivation and energy, again, shifts away from money and pay for performance, extrinsic rewards, carrots and sticks, to purpose and meaning, belonging, joining a company or joining a group or belonging to a group where working on meaningful stuff and we all share in and we all are working on something bigger than ourselves. That's where real work happens. And then the third piece is really not so much, there's a lot of focus on feedback in performance management, and I think the center of that shifts more toward progress. So it's not looking at just getting feedback. It's again focusing on goals, and what really motivates people is progress against goals, not feedback. And so I think a lot of the motivational energy in the future, especially as we teach supervisors how to manage people, will be focusing on progress. In your example of the football team, coaches working with players saying, you know what? You used to not be able to do that, and now you can do that. You're getting better, and and here's how we can help you get better. It's focusing on progress. That's, I think, where what will create real motivation and energy in the future. So I think we're spending $345 billion a year, and I think we're getting heroic efforts from people despite what we do to them, and despite what we're spending on them for motivation. Not because of it. And I think in the future, we're going to figure that out. And not that money is that money. Let's use that money to manage pay and manage comp and keep people up with the market. And we need to manage pay, but managing pay is different than motivating employees. So I think that's the future, is the more deeper and more powerful motives.
Interesting. And I think, so beautifully said. And thank you for walking me through that. I think one thing that I've observed from my personal experience. So if I take a live example of my family, so my dad worked with the company for his entire life. He just started there and he's retired from that company. I pretty much I have a churn cycle of about, I think, 7-8 years. And if I see my new hires, typically young grads, or young folks, they are churning at 3 years, 2 years, however. So when you have this loyalty bandwidth declining, right? So you have workers that are now sort of churning out more than they anticipated to churn. How does it impact the performance or the motivation? Like, what is now the role of say performance management or motivation control in this era of shortening life cycle of an employee within a company? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I think, I wonder if is there really a loyalty problem? Are employees are employees still looking for a long-term play, but they are just increasingly disappointed with the long-term prospects? So I truly wonder about that, because I think we can paint. This is my experience with one company and my experience studying employees at that company. But what we found is you cannot paint with a very broad demographic brush. Young people, there are young people who are still very long-term oriented. So I'm not sure that it's so much that employees and people are different as much as it is companies are not delivering a value proposition that makes people want to stay around for that long. So I wonder whether the problem isn't companies and not people, and are we creating a value proposition for employees and future employees that is compelling enough? And the other point, so that's one question. The other point is, you're absolutely right. 1 to 2 year period is critical. Most companies, the inflection point in turnover, the highest rate is in that 1 to 2 year period. So basically, if you're a company, you have 1 to 2 years to make a case for employees, which puts lots of pressure on hiring, lots of pressure on onboarding, lots of pressure on communicating a value proposition that is compelling for them to get them to join, and delivering on a value proposition early on that is compelling enough to get them to stay. And I don't think companies have the lens. I think you could argue that we should focus almost all of our energy early on, first 8 weeks, first 90 days with employees, and focus heavily on recruiting. Now, the problem with recruiting is it's a sales job, so we oversell and then we don't deliver. And so part of this is balanced selling as a recruit, when you're recruiting, realistic previews of what we're going to get, what we're going to deliver to you, but then actually very early on getting people engaging people very early on in real meaningful work, and delivering on again, all these things, delivering on purpose and meaning and challenging work, and building a team that they can feel like they want to belong to contribute really meaningfully in a year or two, which means you don't have a lot of time. You have to deliver on that value proposition quickly. I think many especially big companies, take a long time to get people in, a long time to get people integrated. Most of the early work in getting people into the organization is administrative. Do they have a computer? Do they have an ID? Do they have a badge? And it's all logistics and administration, not thinking about motivation and the opportunity to create purpose and meaning and connection to the company, connection to the customers and the larger good that we serve. And I think Aaron Hurst's work and the purpose economy and you can do this in companies where you wouldn't necessarily think that you can do it. Shake Shack. You can do this in large companies where it's easy to do if you work for a hospital system or where the purpose is noble to begin with. But I think people can get very excited about what companies deliver to customers and other important stakeholders, and we just spend very little time engaging them in that kind of context. And I think that kind of context in the future will be critical, because you have to create meaning and purpose. Otherwise, people won't hang around. And I think we're going to see this cycle happen. If you can't create meaning and purpose, a compelling purpose and challenging work that engages people, they're going to find someplace else to go. And the barriers are dropping. I mean, companies are more progressive companies like, Patagonia, Tom's Shoes, are already, exploiting that and saying, well, let's get people excited about what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Interesting. And I think so. One more thing I was thinking about in a couple of my previous conversations. So I get this sort of two extreme of conversation when I talk to HR executives. So one is, hey, I treat my employees as a building block of taking us into this future that we don't know where, but we're excited to go there. The other mindset is, hey, employees are Kleenex. So we use it, we exhaust it, and then we throw it out, right? So and then sort of we look for the new sheet now to keep my table always fresh. What is, as we are heading into this future, like what's your perception of what is the right mindset, or if there is one?
So was the question about the second option is more, hire them and then fire them as they, or yes, say more about what you, about your second scenario, the second alternative.
So it's basically, the argument is that, so I was talking to this company, one of the Fortune 500, and sort of growing rapidly. And they were saying that for last 2 decades, their core has been shrinking. The core sort of companies that pretty much represents that company. So basically their perspective is that employee to many perspective for us are these Kleenex sheets that we get the freshest batch, clean the table, looks beautiful, and throw it in the garbage. And then there's a huge discussion of, hey, so does that mean that it's Kleenex's job to keep itself fresh after taking care of your whatever, or do you own a responsibility of cleaning the sheet for the next guy to use, or whatever that argument, right? So that's the case. So which one do you think where we are heading to, and what's the resolve?
Well, I mean, I think we're heading in that direction, the second option now, and I'm not sure that that's the right strategy. That's the appropriate strategy. Because I think, what's happening is there are fewer traditional building block employees in companies, much more outsourcing, much more contracting, and this is all focused on cost, right? And again, focused on cost, and you go up one level, focused on shareholders. How can we create shareholder return? How can we manage our costs, keep costs down? That's pushing jobs outside, pushing jobs offshore, pushing towards contractors, a much more to keep variable costs down, much more flexible arrangements. So we can, and remember, this only works if you can fire these people, and cut contractors. So I think we've, the move toward employees kind of as Kleenex sheets, I think is driven by short-term cost pressures. And I just don't know whether that's, and the assumption is that we treat them like Kleenex and like resources, like capital resources. And I think the reality is in the future, that's not going to serve us well. Those of us who work in big companies with big procurement organizations know how we treat vendors. Okay, we get the thumb screws out, we put the thumb screws on them, and we squeeze them to get every last dime from them. And that kind of approach to treating human capital resources, I think in the future, is not going to be effective, because what you find is when you treat vendors that way, they don't help you diagnose your business. They don't help you improve your business. There's nobody better to help you improve your business than somebody that does business with you. We do that with IT contractors, in a huge way. We treat them terribly. They don't help us. They see problems with our processes, but because we treat them so terribly, they're not interested in helping us with our processes. I think in the future, it's going to be different. In the future, you are going to be dependent on these people for your work. You're not going to be able to treat them like Kleenex. You're going to have to treat them like full partners. Because you're going to have partners that they're going to be partners. They're not going to be vendors. Because they're going to be doing work that isn't trivial work anymore. They're going to be doing work that is more core for your strategy. And the reason that's going to happen is because you're not smart enough as a company. You're going to have to depend on them. You're not smart enough or you can't, you don't have the budget, or you don't have the, the latitude to hire all these people. So you're going to have to admit as a company, we're not smart enough to do it on our own. We're going to need these outsiders, and we're going to need their creative energies and their ideas and their insights, not just their low cost services. And I think it's, that's already happening in the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry, where when you look at lots of pharmaceutical innovation is not coming from internal R&D labs. It's coming from outside labs where smart people are doing really interesting stuff, and our job is to find it and bring it in and help them develop it. So I think the partnerships are going to be critical in the future. So whether they're our own or inside our walls or outside our walls, we're not going to be able to treat our resources like that. We're not going to get the innovation and ideas from them if we do.
Interesting. And I think so. Your mention about stockholder value, I think it reminded me of a very interesting conversation I had with one of the CFO of a reasonably sized company, and I was talking to him about this value creation and sort of how much cost is impacting the decision making, and he gave me a very interesting example. So he said, Vishal, you know what? Imagine in a world where all of your customer run away. Would you survive? I said, no. He said, imagine if all your employees run away. Would you survive? I said, no. He said, imagine all the shareholders run away. Would you survive? I said, maybe. Right. So he said, that's the market perception that needs to change. That many times, many businesses rely too much and sort of too deep into sort of keeping the shareholders happy on the company, ignoring their workers or the clientele. I said, eventually what will happen, and I think you pointed out that Tom Shoes and a lot of these companies are emerging who are now keeping sort of employees and their customers at the front and center and saying, okay, we'll be just loyal to these guys. We don't care about price earning ratios. We'll do well. And Amazon is a great example. A lot of companies who are just showing negative returns and still surviving a pretty good run when it comes to in stock market. So what's your take on that? Like what's your take in this sort of new mindset of how it is impacting the performance and sort of how should the businesses who are doing it right are how what's their recipe of success when it comes to looking at improving the performance and motivation of the workers?
Yeah, I just think the lens, it's the lens is the problem. The lens of focusing on shareholder return, and the way that gets implemented in organizations is cost reduction and short-term profit. Focused on exploitation versus exploration. And so I think the market will sort out the winners and the losers in terms of exploration, the value of exploration versus exploitation. But when it comes to managing employees and to managing those activities, you manage exploration activities very differently than you manage exploitation activities. And we manage those activities the same way always. So we always use a short-term cost, extrinsic motivation, financial lens to all of our activities and organizations. And I think that just has a cost. So what we end up with is, again, this lens of $345 billion of investment money in motivation. But it's, it's not really looked at that way. That's looked at, that budget is looked at as something that we can cut. And what you find is companies routinely underspend that budget for themselves because it gets cut. And what we have is this short-term kind of shareholder financial cost mentality applied to activities and motivation that probably shouldn't be used, be thought of it, with that kind of lens. And so, that's why I think one of the chief problems in the reward space is because one of the most prominent problems in the reward space is cost reduction. And the reality is, maybe we shouldn't be thinking about motivation only in the reward space. Maybe we should think about it in other spaces, because those budgets are going to get cut. And we need to realize you can motivate people without necessarily increasing those budgets. So it's changing the whole way you think about what you do with that budget, and other ways to motivate that don't really cost any money. And that's the big paradigm. One of the big paradigm problems with performance management is this zero sum kind of thinking. That you got a big pot of money, and if we spend more here, we have to spend less here, and it's always a zero sum game. And motivation isn't a zero sum game. I mean, everybody can be motivated. You don't motivate some at the cost of motivation of others. And so I think we just have to change the way we think about motivation, and not think about it in terms of financially, but also just thinking more, thinking more explorationally about the activities that HR engages in rather than exploitatively. And it's not just a cost game. It's not just a short-term return game, but a long-term investment game. I think that's one of the most fundamental problems with HR is it all gets lumped in together. It's all a cost game. It's all an expense, not an investment. And we have to think of motivation more as an investment than an expense.
Interesting. And I want one more perspective, one more of your perspective, and one interesting thought. So motivation is always linked to, many times, number one, loyalty to certain degrees, and the change and the work that you're supposed to do. So if the work landscape itself is changing, so I think I recently, couple of years back, I spoke to one of the gentlemen from LinkedIn, and we were discussing about this research, that one of their internal research, and there was a talk about that. I think by 2025, most of us would have 1.8 jobs. So pretty much they were pointing towards this gig economy, right? So now most of us are working on instead of one, maybe on multiple jobs right now, or we will eventually be. How would that landscape be perceived from the performance lens? Like, how would businesses would look at performance management when they see dealing with more contractors than they are looking at it nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I think it. Well, first of all, this is absolutely happening. So we have to deal with it. So I think this is one of the things for me that absolutely it kind of blows up your traditional way of thinking about performance management. So how do you motivate people you don't own? And in the past, again, with a more short-term expense-oriented view of capital, of labor, in the past you wouldn't worry about it. You would say, well, they're contractors. I treat them like expenses anyway, and we can get rid of them. In the future, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to depend on these workers for success. They're going to be more important to your success than just traditional expenses that you can cut. So I think we do have to think about how do you quote manage them in a performance management sense. How do I motivate them? And John Boudreau's got a great book called Lead the Work. He's got lots of examples in there, like aerospace is what's coming to my mind with if you're in aerospace, and if you're Boeing, you have thousands of partners. to build a 767. And you can't, those people are doing critical work for you. They have to feel like they have to share the same sense of purpose and meaning that your employees do. They have to feel the same sense of pride when they see that plane take off. They have to own that. And that's the sense that you have to create with all these workers, gig workers, contractors, partners, that, whoever they are, whether you own them, you sign their paycheck or not, you have to create that sense of meaning and purpose and pride, because you don't control their merit budget. That they work for some outside firm, you don't control that. You have to give up the idea that money will motivate them, and you have to create meaning, and you have to create belonging. They're all part of a team. You have to create a sense of, we're on the 767 team, or we're on the fuselage team, or we're on the cockpit team. And create that sense of meaning and purpose and belonging, feeling a part of something larger. And companies, I think, like Boeing, I think they've done that. I think they've created a sense that we're all working on the same thing, even though we don't all work for the same company. And and I think the gig workers. I mean, I just love this because I came from a the pharmaceutical company where we have problems that we can't solve, and we put them out on the web with incentive and let people just get on and crowdsource solve them. What you're creating, you have to create something compelling so people you don't even know choose to help you. Sure, those people are paid, but in many ways, that's a token part of it. So I think managing this kind of workforce in the future absolutely just blows up the whole idea of the way we manage and motivate people with performance management or rewards. You don't control their rewards, so you have to think about how you get them together, how you create meaning and purpose for them, how you create team objectives. You're all part. You create teams with your partners, and how you manage yourselves and work together over the time period of your project, which is probably not a year. So this is not an annual process anyway. So I think it blows it all up, which I think it is the stimulus we need for real innovation, I think, in this area.
Interesting. And now let's go to the individuals who are leading this charter of so-called performance management or motivational control. So how do you define if I'm an executive and taking care of or figuring out the motivational index for my workers or my team or however I want to spend it? What are some of the tangible steps you would recommend to someone who sort of has this charter to motivate it and keep this worker happy? Like, what do you suggest as some of the tactical steps I should do?
Well, the short answer is that the easy part is what they should start doing. The hard part is what they should stop doing. I mean, I have no trouble getting people to say what you need to do is make this a team sport. Instead of an individual sport, do planning and work unit planning and performance management with teams, set team objectives, individual objectives in the context of team objectives, focus on progress, and focus heavily on setting goals up front, and not just goal setting, but it's not so much the goals that's important, it's the process that's important. It's the creation of context. So I understand, if I'm a partner with Boeing, I understand what we're doing. I understand the context. And you share a lot more with them than you used to. So they need to understand everything. So they understand the context and the meaning. They can get meaning and purpose from this. And they also, obviously, they get goals and objectives and timelines and so on. But it's the context and the meaning that are really important. It's easy to get executives to buy into that. What's hard for them is to say, oh, and by the way, you got to give up money as a motivator, and you got to give up your variable pay and performance management systems. You got to focus so much less on identifying the 15% elites in your organization, and much more time identifying the 80, and using the 85% that are really solid contributors. Because the 15% of your elites In the future, it's not going to be like that. In the future, you're going to need all 100%, because in the future, you're not going to know who your elites are. Okay, if you follow, I mean, I love this book. We can talk about books maybe later, but I spent a day with Bob Johansen from the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. Wrote a book called The New Leadership Literacies, and I am very bullish on the future. Everyone has a view of the future. It leads every article you read, and they turn the future into a scenario that advantages their products. Okay, I'm generally very skeptical of talk about the future, but Bob Johansen is a real thing. Institute for the Future, the book, and when you look at that kind of book, so organizations are kind of shape shifting, and they grow from the edges, and they have no center, and they have no hierarchy. In a world like that, you don't know who your valuable people are. All of a sudden, if you're Amazon and you're pursuing a business idea, somebody that you do not have your radar, that is not on your radar screen, knows a lot about that. All of a sudden, they become very valuable to you. And then you move on, and other things become valuable. So you have these hierarchies, and these organizations, these teams pop up. You build a hierarchy around them. You commission some work. You do a bunch of great work, and then they disappear. And then something pops up over here. These ideas. So the point of that is, you don't know who's going to really be valuable to you. And somebody that's not very valuable to you, or you don't see as valuable to you, all of a sudden becomes very valuable to you. And you won't be able to forecast it. So I think the idea is, quit thinking about the elites, my high performers, my high potentials, because most of them are not getting there on their own anyway. Most of them are very well supported from other people. They're getting lucky, and there's a whole body of research on the talent myth and how we kind of deify these individuals. We're very individualistic in these systems, and we focus heavily on the individuals that separate themselves. Whether they separate themselves with talent and hard work, or whether they separate themselves with luck and a good supportive team and firm-specific kinds of resources. So I think we're going to have to focus on the 100%, not the 80, not the 15% in the future, because I think we're not going to be able to see the opportunities until they're right in front of us, and then we're not going to have time to go find somebody and hire them. Okay, we're going to have people. We're going to have people that already know about these things, and all of a sudden they're going to become extremely relevant.
Interesting, beautifully said. And I think I want your perspective on. So if we summarize whatever we have discussed so far, like what are some of the big ideas here? Like what are some of the big sort of if opportunities for anyone who want to explore and sort of really help shape the performance management landscape for everyone? Like what are some of the big ideas here at play?
Yeah, I would say, again, make no mistake, big idea number one is get rid of all the stuff we're doing now. That's the hard one. Stop the ruthless kind of mercenary evaluation and differentiation of people, and distribution, differentiation of rewards. So that's hard. And that's where all the resistance. In terms of the other big ideas, I think there are probably 3 or 4 big ideas. One is by the way, change the system from one that is focused on evaluation and differentiation to one that's focused on strategy implementation, a system that provides direction. This becomes a management process for executives to help align employee work with strategy and strategic goals. Okay, so it becomes a real management process, like budgeting, like long-term planning, forecasting. It's how we decide what we spend resources on and what we don't. So that's big. I think big idea number one is this doesn't serve employees anymore. This serves leadership, and it serves to derive direction and alignment to strategy. So this serves the business. The second big idea is as soon as you say that, what it says is goals and the process for setting objectives. The first part of PM, which very few companies really focus much on, except to the extent that this is a contracting process. Okay, the way we think about goals, the goal setting process now is it's contracting. What are the contracts? This is service level agreements for employees. What are you going to do? And what are the reward contingencies that are at stake if you do it at the end of the year? In the future, it's different. Okay, it's goals, and the goal setting process is it's the centerpiece of the future of this process. It's the way you make meaning and purpose for employees. And it's not so much, again, the output that's important, the goal setting, the goals at the end of it. This is a continuous process of what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Making context, creating context for employees. A lot more context and a lot more transparency are going to be required in the future than we are now. Employees need to know exactly everything about why we're doing what we're doing. In part because things change so fast, you're not going to be able to get everybody together and say, hey, wait a minute, time out. We're not doing this, we're doing this. People need to understand that everything about what we're doing and why we're doing it, so they can adjust on the fly in the moment. And when people understand deeply the context for their work and what we're trying to achieve, they can adjust on their own. You trust them. They understand it. Whether that's partners or suppliers or vendors, they can make these choices for the good of the business on the fly. And they're going to have to, because things are going to change that fast in the future. So big idea, I think, number 2 is goals, and the goal setting process is really central, and it's focused on meaning making and purpose, creating meaning and creating purpose for employees. I think that the third piece of this, again, this is, we focus a lot on feedback and performance management. And feedback and performance management traditionally is mostly on negative, delivering messages to employees. Again, as if we're going to have to fire every one of our employees. We treat them. We mostly are focused on delivering negative messages, preparing people to get low raises, because it's a zero-sum game. That we get a few get high raises and lots get low raises, and our goal is to prepare people for low bonuses, low raises. This is a different. I mean, in the future, I think the focus is much less on feedback and more on, again, goals and progress and business performance are central. So it's not feedback that's critical. It's not feedback that motivates. It's progress that motivates. And there's lots of good research, lots of research on most of this comes out of emotion and affect in the workplace. And when you dig into that research, it all comes back to progress. What produces positive emotions, positive affect in organizations. Oh, and by the way, the research is very clear. Positive affect drives performance, drives fulfillment, drives satisfaction, engagement, and so on. But when you look at what drives positive affect, it's progress against goals. So it's progress that motivates, not feedback. So I think the other big idea is that progress is got to be central to this. If you're a supervisor, you have a team, your job is progress. Whether it's, and obviously that involves feedback, it involves information, but it also involves support, resources, all the other things. My job is to make sure you make progress on your work every day. Because if you don't, I don't make progress. Because my progress is your progress. And which is really the last big idea is, again, and we said this, performance management in the future is a team sport, not an individual sport. So this happens at the team level. When we win, I win. And so we do this as a team. Traditional performance management is very individualistic. Individuals set objectives, individuals get feedback, individuals get rated, and individuals get rewarded. And I think in the future, it's not going to be like that. Teams are going to set objectives because we're all going to need to worry about how we get this work done. Teams are going to get feedback. We're going to get together as teams, troubleshoot why it's not working, figure out how to get it to work. What do we need to go? What resource do we need? And the boss is going to be providing the support, resources, coaching, all that stuff. And then in the end, I think the big change is that no mercenary, individualistic variable pay programs. It's all when we win, I win. And that's the biggest mindset shift, I think, for performance management is
Interesting.
we go to much more profit sharing, gain sharing programs, team-based rewards. So when we win, I win. And now there are plenty of ways to manage compensation outside of that. In the future, I think you promote people more often. You don't deal with comp. People love narrow band or broad banding because administratively it's a lot easier. I think in the future we go back to narrow banding. We promote people for more often. We give them, we keep them whole with the market. We give them market-based pay increases. We give them, I think even more radically, and Netflix does this, you pay the person, not the job. In the future, the job is going to go. The job is a meaningless construct in the future anyway. Work is going to happen. Tasks are going to get reconfigured. We mostly focus on work now, not jobs. Jobs are just we can't be that specific about who's going to do what. It's going to be more like a scrum in the future. So you can't pay individuals like that anyway. You pay organizationally, and you have much more organizational-based incentive programs, and you keep people up with the market, and promote them more often, and pay them individually. We do this we do this now in organizations, and even though we don't say it. So you had a good year. People make excuses for how they want to reward people anyway. We already create our own stories because I want to give you 6% this year. We'll find a way to do it anyway. We already pay people individually. And in the future, we're going to have as many jobs as we have people. I mean, they literally are going to be configured and configurable like that. So we might as well start thinking about paying people anyway. That's a very radical idea for comp people to get their head around. And again, Netflix does this stuff. Netflix, I think, is one of the shining stars in this area and part of it's because they designed it this way from the beginning. And if you, again, another book, Patty McCord's book on Netflix, is fascinating because they designed it this way from the beginning because they didn't have time. They were moving so fast. They didn't have time to engineer and design all these variable pay programs and performance management programs. Things are changing so fast for them. They're growing so fast. They said, we're just not going to do any of this stuff. And now dismantling that stuff for organizations is hard. But I think it's doable. I think we're going to have to go, slowly begin to dismantle the individual pay infrastructure, the focus on bonuses and merit pay, and go back to more merit-based or market-based pay, raise people's pay with market-based pay increases, cost of living increases. And people hate cost of living increases because, again, they're coming from a perspective of this is how can 2 or 3%, motivate somebody? And the answer is it never did. You were not motivating people with your merit pay before. What you're doing is keeping them whole with the market. Because if you don't do that, you're going to lose them. So the conversation you have about market-based pay increases or cost of living increases is not a traditional motivation conversation the way you would normally have it. You can still have a motivation conversation in the context of a cost of living increase, but it's different than it was in the past. So there are lots of ways you can manage pay, increase pay, keep people's pay growing, and keep people excited without doing all the crazy, variable pay programs that we have now.
Interesting.
And that's the hard part, because when you say to an executive, and I have done this, you say, you know what, I think we should do it. We should get rid of pay for performance. The look in their eye. I mean, it's as if you asked them why they walk upright. Okay, it's like, well, how else would you do it? And so part of the problem is a classic kind of failure to see problem. They don't see an alternative. And if we can show them real alternatives that work, and oh, by the way, there's lots of research that profit sharing, gain sharing programs work extremely well. companies that implement those programs see mid to high single digit productivity increases without all the craziness that is associated with individual variable pay programs, all the manipulation, distortion, all the crazy side effects that you get with those programs. So there's lots of ways to solve these problems, but you have to get people comfortable that they can do it.
Interesting. Beautifully put, by the way, and thank you so much for sharing that. So we're at the tail end of the conversation, and I think I want to spend some time on your journey. So I think we ask all of our guests is, so in your journey, so what are some of the qualities that is attributed to your success? What would you attribute those qualities to? Like, what would you say some of the traits that has helped you stay sane and growing throughout your progression in this?
I would say, for me, I think you have to be, just have to be flexible. I think in the future, it's even going to be more so. So I think I've always been a fairly curious guy. So something new is always, was always more exciting to me, even if it was a little frightening. So I think for me, being curious has helped. And I think the other thing that is for me is important is to be evidence based. That's why I've always had a strong kind of theoretical, empirical research orientation, because for the most part, I know there's a body of research out there that has studied this, and I can depend on that, and I can feel confident. I can project more confidence that these things will work. If I'm more evidence-based versus relying on more political skill and influence. The other thing I would say is, and I still remember Bob Quinn, who's at University of Michigan. We worked with Bob Quinn long ago, and he get the advice he gave us and other people in HR, other leaders as well, that I think I have embodied it. It has not served me. It probably has not served me all that well. But that Bob used to say, if you're not putting your career on the line every day, you're probably not doing your job. And those of us who are in organizational helping roles, internal consulting roles, HR roles, talent management roles, at some level we need to have knowledge that the organization doesn't have, and we need to push and advocate more. I think more enthusiastically than we have in the past. And some organizations are not accustomed to their HR people doing that, but I think when the kind of the kind of environment that we're facing now and the kind of changes that's going to force into the organization, I think we're going to, which is why we need to be good students of what's happening and the way you solve these problems organizationally, is we're going to have to push because we know things the organization needs, and we're going to have to push hard to get them to change. And so I think we're going to have to put you have to put your career on the line occasionally to make real change happen in organizations. That's always, it's caused me some pain and suffering, as an internal guy. If you want to, rule number one for change agents inside, stay alive. Okay. Yeah. And when you put your career on the line, you risk not staying alive, because they can buy what you offer on the outside. But I think if we're going to change organizations, we have to push harder than we're pushing now, and put our foot down. Don't be afraid to take your shoe off and pound on the table. I think we have to do more of that. Be less diplomatic, less of a concierge, and more, concierge says, what do you want to do? A good concierge will say, here's what you should do. So that's the kind of role I think we need to play in the future.
Interesting. And your favorite reads. So I think one other question we ask all of our guests is, what are some of their favorite reads that they want to share with our listeners and viewers? Like, what would that be?
Well, to me, I think I've already said a couple. One would be Bob Johansson's book on the new Leadership Literacies, which is 2017, I think, put out by the Institute for the Future. Again, if you're like me, there's two things that turn me off. One is someone talking about the future and telling me how it's going to advantage their services. Institute for the Future and Bob are different than that. Second thing is any leadership list, any list of leadership characteristics turns me off. In part because most of these things are, again, one of my favorite reads is The Black Swan, Nassim Taleb, and what you have this kind of this thing, the narrative fallacy and the missing data problem, missing evidence problem that for the most part, people study successful leaders and say, here are the things you need to do, and the reality is, did you go look in the leadership graveyard? Go look at all the dead leaders. They did all the same things. Okay, so I'm very skeptical about leadership lists. So when Bob's book, The New Leadership Literacies, I immediately said, I'm not going to like this. Now the reality is that's not what he's providing. This is a picture of the future, the dynamics and the kind of the vectors that are changing in the future and how leaders are going to need to respond. And it's an amazing read. I mean, it's absolutely amazing read, and very quick read, but it's very, very powerful. So that one for sure. I also mentioned Patty McCord's book on Netflix. It's just a picture of somebody who did it differently. They thought differently, they act differently, and they're still very successful. Okay, so the idea is you can dismantle this stuff and still be successful. You need to reality test and say, well, maybe my fears are not justified. Maybe all my best people won't leave if we abandon our kind of ruthless individualistic pay practices. And we found that's not why our best people were there to begin with. And so part of it is just reality testing. So that's a great read on how you think differently about this stuff, and a case for suggesting maybe we should consider it. The other read, I think anyone who works, every leader in an organization should have this book on their shelf. It should be required reading before we put you in front of any decision, is Kahneman's book, Think Fast and Slow. And that's just the Daniel Kahneman's book is that's a summary of all of his research with Amos Tversky, and you can read Michael Lewis's book as well, which covers a lot of that. It's a little easier read. Think Fast and Slow is not written in a narrative kind of fashion, but it's absolutely critical. If you make decisions in organizations, you have to read it. I mean, it's all about bias and ways, the things that get in the way for of good decision making, chief of which is intuition and fast thinking. So should be required reading. I'd say the last thing, and I mentioned this as well, one of my favorite change books, and this is a fairly old book today, but I love this book. It's it's called Leading Strategic Change by Hal Gregerson and Stuart Black. It's like a early 2000s book, and I use it a lot, and I talk about it in the book I wrote. But there are three reasons why organizations and individuals fail to change: failure to see, failure to move, and failure to finish. So some companies, they don't see the need to change, and they don't change, and they go out of business. I think Blockbuster is. I mean, talk about Netflix. Blockbuster Video is a good example, and they just closed the last store. So the end of an era. Toys R Us may be another good example. But Netflix or Blockbuster never saw Netflix coming. I mean, at some level, their business model was bricks and mortar, late fees. That they suffered from a failure to see. They just didn't see the changes in the marketplace happening. I think they also suffered from a failure to move. Once they saw it, Reed Hastings came in and actually presented to the Blockbuster board and said, "Let us manage your online business." They were laughed out. So once they saw the things happening, they failed to move. So you see the changes that you need to make, but you can't make them.
Mm.
And then the last is kind of failure to finish. So some people get started, they make changes and they start down this path, but they lose energy, they lose momentum, and they don't finish. So that book is what we suffer from in this part, especially in the talent management, HR, performance management, rewards, is a failure to see. When you say to an organization, and I did this, the reason I wrote the book I wrote was after a conversation with someone at a regional medical center who was at a conference wanting to learn how you implement more contemporary pay for performance management systems. And I remember asking her this question. I said, are you guys having trouble attracting people? No, our people are, we have a great mission-based system and mission, and people are lined up to be a part of what we're creating. Do you have trouble, a turnover problem? Do you have trouble holding on to people? No. Then why on earth are you wanting to implement these modern systems? And it's truly this failure to see. They don't see an alternative. And that's why somebody like Netflix and other companies, mostly these are small tech companies and software companies that are abandoning commissions or abandoning ratings. They're doing different things, and the sky isn't falling. Netflix didn't lose all their people; they still attract people. So it can be done. And so the Black Gregerson book is great. Thinking about how you overcome each of those three problems. How do you overcome a failure to see? How do you overcome a failure to move? How do you overcome failure to finish? It's an awesome book.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now we're at the last but not the least. And by the way, thank you so much for being really, really generous with your time. So if you want our listeners and viewers to take away something from this conversation, like what is that snappy bite that you could suggest listeners and viewers to take away from our conversation?
Well, I'd probably go back to the comment, the comment I made about Bob Quinn. You have to put your career on the line every day. That's at some level. Again, I think I said this at the beginning. We're going to have to change. Talent management, compensation, the way we think about motivation control, which is mostly HR processes, is going to have to change. It's going to be hard. If you want easy, keep throwing money at people. Okay, but if you want effective, you're going to have to stop throwing money at people and start really engaging them with stronger motives. But the key point is that it's going to be hard. If you want easy, throw money. If you want hard, if you want effective, it's going to be hard. And you're probably going to make some enemies in your organization. You're going to say things people aren't going to want to see, aren't going to want to hear necessarily. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be a little dangerous, but you're going to have to do it. Otherwise, we're going to, I think companies are already making these changes. Progressive companies are already turning, and like anything else, there will be kind of a tipping point where you're going to be behind, and it's going to be hard. Everyone will, progressive companies will have adjusted their value proposition accordingly, and you're going to be behind. And so I think that tipping point will happen very quickly, and pretty soon companies will be behind. They'll be losing talent. They won't get the best talent. It's because they're still dealing with an old value proposition. So if you're going to change it early, you're going to have to push hard and put your career on the line, I think.
With that, thank you so much, Alan. I think it was fabulous, and thank you for being really generous with your time and helping us understand the landscape of performance management. It's very critical, as we all know, the work is changing, the organization is changing, and giving us a perspective to our listeners and viewers on how the performance management will impact or will be impacted as with this change, and what some of the leaders could do today. Really, really helpful. And you're always welcome back on the podcast to share your story. Wish you nothing but success, and thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us.
No, I'm happy to do it, and thanks for the provoking, perturbing the system, disrupting the system, provoking the system with what's happening in the future, because it's going to be here before we know it, and we got to be ready for it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the surface.